I think to some extent Tanzania and Zambia have similar programs. They have been in similar situations since like 10 to 15 years to some extent, with strong economic growth, but still persistent problems in terms of that economic growth not benefiting the entire population. So both countries have been looking where to invest to make sure that those who are particularly vulnerable can also catch up, benefit from the growth, and ensure well-being for themselves and their children. So Tanzania has established a social action fund, an institution called TASAF, the Tanzania Social Action Fund. And recently, under that institution, a safety net program has been established with a cash transfer component. And that is similar to what Zambia decided after a number of years of experimenting. Since 2010, the government of Zambia also decided to bring that cash transfer program progressively to scale. And that has happened also in Tanzania. So since 2013, 14, the government decided to move ahead with that cash transfer expansion. And in both countries, as we speak now, those programs reach approximately 10% of the population, with a focus on the vulnerable population. A number of measures have been put in place. Both in Zambia and Tanzania, the government recruited additional government officials at central level, but also at district level. And for every district that is rolling out the cash transfer program in Zambia, an additional assistant social welfare officer has been recruited. But then when it comes to the lower level, both programs have also relied on volunteers, because there are no government officials below the ward level in the communities or in the villages. So they have been relying on volunteers to help them identify and select vulnerable households, monitor payments, follow up when families have questions, to communicate about those programs. And all those volunteers have benefited from extensive training. And so that has created a relevant capacity. I think there are other challenges also that these programs have faced. One of them is to have the program accepted by all stakeholders in government, but also outside government, in the general public, in the communities. People have typically seen cash transfers as, as handouts. And they perceived cash transfers as having a risk of making people dependent on those transfers, as making people lazy even. We know now, after many years of evaluations and studying those programs, that that is absolutely not the case. I think you can even say that very poor and vulnerable families, they just cannot afford receiving these funds just as a handout. We know that across the board families have invested this money to improve their food security, but also to keep their children in school, to buy school uniforms for children so that they can attend secondary school when the uniform is compulsory. Families have invested in their farms, in small enterprises. They bought livestock, assets. All of this was a relatively small amount of money. And that has generated what we call multiplier effects. So through investments, eventually these families have earned more than the value of the transfer alone. In Zambia, there is now a lot of evidence available that shows that, and in Tanzania, evaluations are ongoing, and we hope that they can show the same findings as evaluations in many countries in the regions have shown. And having these findings, like the homegrown information and showing what the program makes in terms of a difference for these people, will help to make the program more acceptable in the broader government portfolio of services and interventions for vulnerable people. I think what the government of Zambia has done particularly well is to launch the evaluation of a social cash transfer, as I said, to make the program acceptable, but also to make it a credible source of budget allocation from the government budget. When people are not convinced that this is a very efficient and effective way to address poverty, they are also at some point reluctant to make decisions about budget allocation. Now, some key stakeholders or champions in the government of Zambia have insisted on this evaluation and the dialogue around the findings to push for higher budget allocations. And I think that's a particularly good practice in Zambia, where since 2 or 3 years the government funds the larger share, up to 80% of what the program costs. And Tanzania is still struggling with that. The program is largely funded by development partners. The government also has attracted a loan to partially fund the Tanzania Social Action Fund, the safety net program. So there you see still some struggle to come up with a more sustainable, structural way of financing the program. And despite the very positive evidence about what this very small amount of money can do for vulnerable and poor families, despite what we know how affordable these programs are, not more than 1 to 5% of the government budget, reaching more than 1 million households. We also know that this amount of money is not sufficient to sustainably improve the well-being and the education of the population. In the first place, you also need services. You need good schools, good health facilities. But you also need other types of support to help families really take advantage now of that stability they have achieved through the cash transfer. And that is what is sometimes referred to as interventions that promote the livelihoods of families, whether it's through agricultural training or to entrepreneurship training or to additional support for their farm. Now, both countries, both Tanzania and Zambia, have been thinking about how to further support poor and vulnerable families. In Tanzania, and I think that's a good practice, this has been integrated in the program. So families who receive a cash transfer ultimately are also provided with an option to participate in public works. So they build some community assets, and in exchange for that they will be rewarded, in particular during the lean season, and there's less work on the farm. And Tanzania has also a third component, which is providing livelihood support to people. Now, how can you help them participate in savings groups? How can you give them the business or other skills to increase their productivity, or to have really take benefit of that cash transfer that is already coming into the household? So that's a good integrated approach, I think, that other countries can learn from. In Zambia, the policy direction has been slightly different. The government has chosen first to significantly scale up the cash transfer, but is now looking at how to come up with an integrated framework of what they call social protection interventions to build on that cash transfer. In Zambia there is the farmer, I think it's input support. There are some agriculture-focused programs that now can further help families already on the cash transfer to lead a more productive life and make the economic investments that they require to sustainably move beyond that minimum income line. And so other countries can learn from that. The second thing I wanted to mention is that countries can learn from, in particular, how Zambia has reached out to influential stakeholders to create support for the program. And I think one very good example is members of parliament. Well, members of parliament, they have a very strong link with their constituency. And so when the program reaches their constituency, they get feedback about the benefits. And then they argue that the program should be expanded to all the areas in their constituency. And that creates an effect like for other MPs also to claim that the program should come to their constituency. And we have seen that happening in Zambia. But the prerequisite was that MPs have full information and understanding about this intervention. Because many of them were also among those who were a bit skeptical. I refer to the handout and great dependency. But sharing the findings of evaluations with them, bringing them to the field, getting the feedback from the people in their constituencies has been really helpful. And I believe that in Zambia now, members of parliament, members of political parties, they really support this program. And gradually we see the same happening in Tanzania, where there is an effort to also connect and expose members of parliament to what the productive social safety net, and in particular the cash transfer component, is doing for vulnerable families. And that is a big lesson, I think, for other countries also.